Good morning. It's a long session this morning, and I know that we're kind of between you and the break, so we'll keep it interesting as much as we can. One of the questions that a couple of the panelists want to ask is to go back to a question I think that Zach asked yesterday when he asked how many architects are there in the audience and how many neuroscientists are there. We'd like to broaden that a little bit because an awful lot of people didn't put up their hands. So how many designers do we have? Okay, designer including architects, a designer in any field that can be construed as design. Okay, how many scientists do we have? Okay, so that becomes a little bit more equal. I think, can you put your hand up if you didn't put your hand up? So we obviously do have some other categories, and we really appreciate your interest in this field. Anyway, I want to go back also to something that Eduardo challenged us with yesterday, which is that let's not just consider sort of the Western world, the privileged part of the Western world in our considerations at this conference and in what we do. And I think that this panel and everything that you've heard this morning indicates that we're talking about a sector of the society that is certainly not, in so many ways, considered privileged, either before they entered the corrections system, we'll call it, and certainly while they're a part of the corrections system. So I'm going to start out by just putting a little bit of context in place for you, and then I'll introduce the panelists and explain the process. So despite actually a reduction over the last 10 years, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. 5% of all Americans will be incarcerated at some point during their lifetime. The American criminal justice system currently holds almost 2.3 million people in state, federal prisons, juvenile correction facilities, local jails, immigration detention facilities, military brigs, and so on. And of all those people who are indeed in that system, homicide and related offenses make up about 3.2% of all sentences. Drug offenses make up about 46%. Immigration offenses make up 7.5%. And in fact, a large proportion of those people who are in prisons today have not yet been sentenced. They're awaiting sentence. So you can see that we're not just talking about hardened criminals. We're not just talking about those who are going to end up in solitary confinement, although that is really the critical end of this problem. So I offer that perspective just as a background to this panel presentation and discussion. We also are hoping that we'll be able to promote a lot of discussion with you. In order to do so, I did ask the panel to sort of throw out some seeds of hypotheses that might be pursued by some of you. Maybe it'll provoke some thoughts that you haven't had yet about the kind of research and investigation that can be done. So we want to challenge you with those takeaways. So, I can just change the slide. Okay, let me introduce the panel. We have three presenters today, and they are Melissa Farling, to my left. She is the principal of Gould Evans in Phoenix, Arizona. She's also a prominent member of the AIA Academy of Architecture for Justice. Jay Farbstein is next to her, and he is the president of Jay Farbstein & Associates in Pacific Palisades, California. Also a member of the AIA Academy of Architecture for Justice. And then joining us remotely in a few minutes will be Rich Weiner, PhD, who is professor of environmental psychology and director of Sustainable Urban Environments, Department of Technology, Culture and Society in the Tandon School of Engineering of New York University. And then we have some discussants who are going to give some responses on the panel and help us to sort of provoke some more discussion with you. We have Eve Edelstein, who is Director of the Human Experience Lab at Perkins & Will. She is a PhD and EDAC, and as Eve told you yesterday, she's been working at the confluence of architecture and neuroscience for many years. And we have Erin Persky, who's Associate AIA, CCHP, from San Diego, California, who's also a very prominent member of the AIA Academy of Architecture for Justice. And so our format will be that the three presenters will present for a total of about 20 minutes, and then we would like to have any responses from our discussants, because at that point we're also going to invite Huda, put her on the spot, to come back up and join us. And then we hope that a question and answer session with you will provoke a lot of discussion, both with the panel and amongst yourselves. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who will continue the introduction to the next presenter.
Good morning. This is on. Good. Thank you so much, Allison, especially for providing that excellent context. It's always an honor to be here, especially after being able to listen to Dr. Akil and Dr. Panda with such information that's so specifically relevant, obviously, to the discussion that we're going to have here. Some of you may know that there's been a group of us exploring the link between neuroscience and corrections and justice work for over 10 years. And in that time, we've conducted workshops, we've done some research, we've shared some of those findings with you here. Every year, we still have more and more questions. There's so much more to understand. I'm just briefly going to review some of our priority research topics, just to give you some awareness, as Allison said. And the first 6 are in the form of a hypothesis. I'll go ahead and read through those. You'll also see that some measures are indicated there, but again, we're hoping to get your input, because that's really what's going to be important. So the first topic is lighting, and lighting in a prison or a jail housing unit that follows natural circadian rhythms will result in better inmate sleep patterns, which will in turn lead to greater calm, less irritability and aggression, and better program participation or work efficiency. And Jay is actually going to be addressing this in more detail shortly. Next topic is acoustics. An improved acoustical environment in a housing unit will lead to better inmate-staff communication, lowered stress levels for all, and better sleep for inmates. We also focused on areas that you see here. As the number of inmates per cell or bedroom increases, inmates will feel less privacy, increased stress, higher levels of aggressive behavior, and potentially increased assaults and vandalism, and indirectly, staff stress will be greater. The next topic on lighting, color, and nature at an intake area, and just to be clear, the intake area of a jail is where, once a person is arrested, this is the first place that they're brought for processing or assessment. It's hypothesized that the introduction of natural or full spectrum light, color, or nature in the intake area will result in the reduction of inmate and staff stress, levels of anger, and of incidents of aggression and violence. This is expected to result for staff in a significant reduction in cortisol levels and heart rate at the end of their shift. It will also result in lower reported stress for inmates and reduced levels of incidents. And several years ago, Jay and I actually presented some findings of a study that we did with Rich Wenner, and we had help from Opali Nanda, who's here, and others too, where we measured the effects of views of nature on stress of officers. Here we go. Pro-social inmate-staff interaction is really important. The increase of pro-social inmate-staff contact reduces inmate disorder because of increased activity of mirror neurons. This is something we're very interested in. The next topic that you see there, it relates more to courthouse design, but it's still very relevant. Empathy is decreased with video testimony, witness and defendant, versus live testimony. This is something that we're really interested in understanding. Now, obviously, Dr. Akil talked about this for quite a long time, so I don't know that anything here is something that she didn't touch on. But just to give you some perspective, solitary confinement and mental health and corrections are very high priorities for us. Actually, when we were here in 2016, we gave a presentation and had a panel that was all about solitary confinement and mental health in the physical environment. As Allison noted, you know, we have more in corrections than anywhere else in the world. And just to tag on to that data for 1 second, our jails and our prisons and our emergency rooms have certainly become our default mental health institutions. And actually, according to the Bureau of Justice, 64% of those in jail are diagnosed with a mental health illness. So there's also others that may not be diagnosed. So I think this last point about how can our concern with mental health lead to new avenues of research within neuroscience is definitely something that's very important to us. So I think this is a good segue to Rich Wenner. Rich, are you on?
Hi, I am on. Can you hear me now?
Good morning. I think it's a little bit low.
Okay, I can adjust this a little if you can adjust it on your end too. Is that any better? Hi, Melissa?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, good. I want to talk a little bit about environmental stress, stress and coping in the jail environment. And my goal here is to provide what I think is a fairly simple, hopefully not simplistic, perspective to lay the basis for some of the other discussion. The basic question is, why are prisons so stressful? Let me add that when I say prisons, it's a shorthand for all kinds of detention, including jail and others. They're all different, but I think some of these issues are very much the same. In one sense, it sounds like a silly question. Well, why is it stressful? Well, of course it's stressful. It's a prison. But I think one has to look at it a little bit closer than that. And basically, the fairly simple and straightforward perspective that I have is that you've got several things going on. On the one hand, what you've got in prisons are a huge number of sources of stress, of environmental stressors. There are many of them, and in many cases, they're at a very extreme level. But at the same time that you have all of those stressors going on, you've also got the loss of most of the mechanisms that we standardly use to cope with stress. So you've got these two things going on at the same time. And I think that's to a large degree what causes the level of problems that one sees. And this is also partly explained when one looks at the basic parameters of environmental stress that we understand from the research that has been done over a number of years and by many different researchers. One of the things that we know is that stress levels and the impacts of environmental stress are very high, are higher with longer exposure. Again, kind of obvious. If you're in a crowded environment, the longer a period of time you're in that environment, the more likely it is to have an impact on you. Also with higher levels of the stressful condition, obviously, again, the more crowded that environment is, the more you're going to feel the impact. In addition, there is research that indicates that stress is cumulative, that multiple sources of stress, each adding their own bit, make the level of experienced stress significantly worse. Again, when you have places in which you experience multiple kinds of stress at one time, that's a problem. And I should add, you know, that is a real world problem. In the laboratory, we try very hard to eliminate all the other sources so that we only have one thing happening at once for obvious reasons, but that's not the way the real world works. Also, as was mentioned at the end of Huda's talk, control is a very powerful factor. A number of studies in many different kinds of environments have all shown that the less control you have over whether you're exposed, over the degree of exposure, over your ability to terminate the exposure, the more stress that you'll experience and the more negative effects will be measured. In addition, there is the level of predictability of the stress. The more variable, the more intermittent is the onset of the stress, the offset of the stress, and the duration, the worse the impacts are. And actually one way that people have talked about predictability is as a kind of cognitive control. So predictability and control to a significant degree go together. So in prisons and jails, as I said, there are so many sources of stress. This is not even a complete list of the kinds that you can experience. There's crowding and isolation. Obviously, those are in many ways opposite conditions, but both are experienced. There is noise levels, a lot of research on noise. Noise is a significant problem in jails and prisons. Odors, bad odors in many ways from many sources. It can be too cold, it can be too hot. I was just talking to someone who was a guard in a prison in Iraq, a military guard, who talked about how they intentionally kept the spaces at 55 degrees so the prisoners would have to curry favor in order to get a blanket. These are not always done that way, but they are problems. Extreme boredom is a serious problem in most detention facilities. The level of lighting, which you'll hear more about in a bit, the quality and the amount of lighting, and when, as was noted about circadian rhythms, it's not just what kind of lighting, but when it hits. The lack of privacy, the inability to have control over access to yourself, visual access, contact access, and obviously the risk, the sense of danger, and again, because it's a prison, the amount of time you're exposed to all these kinds of things. So all of these are there, and they're worsened in prison because of involuntary exposure. Again, a prison is the only legally constituted place in our society where people are held against their will for long periods of time for reasons that do not have to do with their own betterment. So they're unique in that way. So people are held under what can be extreme conditions and compared to any other place in our society for very long periods of time. So again, if we looked at all of those different things that I listed and related to theory of what causes problems with environmental stress, the times of exposure in prisons are unusually high, from hours through years. The quality of the conditions can be extreme in all of these variables, more than we experience in most places. The fact that many, if not all of these, can hit you at any one time. You experience multiple of these stressors at any particular point in time. Prisons are defined in part by the fact that you don't have control, and the lack of predictability is a serious problem, highly intermittent. Again, noise is the one that's been studied the most, but not only. So let me get to the other half of this equation. So we have so many different kinds of environmental stressors, and at the same time, the kinds of things that all of us do all the time to cope are just either totally lacking or extremely limited. What do we do when we're stressed? Well, one of the things that we do is we turn to social contacts. We turn to our friends. We turn to our loved ones. Obviously, that's not something that's so available to prisoners. We try to change and leave the situation or the environment. We try to terminate the problem. We engage in various kinds of activities that make us feel better, that burn calories, that create endorphins. There's all sorts of things that we do to try to essentially change the context that we're in. We use nature, as again, as I'm sure has been discussed at this conference as well as others, but nature has some unique capabilities to help us reduce stress and to be restorative. You make use of our ability to control access to ourselves to help limit the sources of the stress. And we medicate, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, sometimes legally, sometimes otherwise. All of these, again, are just not available to people in jails and in prisons. Sometimes the jail or prison isn't working so well and people can get access to various kinds of drugs, but it's difficult. It may be even especially unhealthy, and it's problematic. So given all of this, one would expect the kinds of outcomes that have been measured and connected to stress to be particular problems in jails and prisons. The development of a variety of kinds of physical illness related to the cardiovascular system, as well as other things. Impacts on cognitive abilities and one's ability to concentrate, the ability to learn, to grow, to solve problems. And again, if you remember that, if you talk to staff members in prisons, one of the things they always tell you is that they feel like they're serving time themselves. These things apply to staff too. And so staff's ability to reduced cognitive abilities and problem solving because of stressors is a special problem there. We know that when people are stressed, their ability to tolerate frustrating conditions is reduced. Research showing that people are less likely to be altruistic, to engage in helping behavior. That when you're stressed, you're more likely to be irritable, more likely to aggressively respond to provocations. Again, if I'm running a prison, these are the kinds of things that I want to make sure I avoid in the setting. All these things make prisons more dysfunctional. We know that, and again, this was talked about in much more depth than I am here, that some of these factors can affect depression and learned helplessness and sleep problems. And as was noted by Dr. Panda, again, if I'm running a prison, sleep problems are one of the things that I don't want to have because of the variety of negative outcomes that can occur there that affect individuals but affect the entire organization. So I think I'm going to leave my framework there and let the rest of the group go on to discuss some of the particular points in detail.
Thank you, Rich. I'm Jay Farbstein, an architect and researcher who has spent most of his career, most of my career, working on the design of these correctional facilities. I want to thank the previous presenters for describing the effects of extreme incarceration on the brain, also for talking about circadian rhythms and their importance when they're disrupted, and to Rich for talking about stress, and Melissa for kind of laying out the framework within our research proposals are formulated. I want to talk about one particular aspect of the complex, a single variable within this very complex environment of the jail or prison, with the intentionally provocative title of correctional lighting is bad for your health. How do we make it go forward? Let's see. Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what was said before, but within the framework of what we heard, I think it has reinforced the notion that we can expect pretty powerful impacts from just this one variable of lighting within the correctional environment. As Rich pointed out, there's a high degree of difference between being in a correctional environment and being out in the free world. There is often little access to natural light, and the artificial light that's provided is often poor in the sense of, generally speaking, not being bright enough during the day, being too bright at night. The artificial light is often, we didn't really talk much about this before, of a spectrum that is not helpful, not appropriate, and does not approach the spectrum of natural daylight from the sun. Rich mentioned the inability for inmates to control the light, to turn it off at night, so it isn't really ever dark. And the length of exposure, as Rich pointed out, can be very long. And as he also pointed out, it affects everybody who's there, maybe the inmates more intensely, but also the staff, especially those who are doing shift work. So the general hypothesis that we're working within is that correctional lighting can be bad for your health. And for desired outcomes of incarceration, safety, program participation, even eventually reduced recidivism, as well as many other kinds of important impacts on the inmates. So as bad as lighting can be, it isn't always terrible. There's a pointer here, right? Okay, so I want to apologize a little bit for the slides. I did a lot of searching on the internet to find night lighting in jails and poor lighting in jails, and I think that even the pictures I've taken, and I've visited an uncountable number of these facilities, I think my camera or my phone kind of just adjusts itself for the low light and makes it look better than it is. So in any case, the slides that I could find about bad lighting are mostly of really old facilities and cells like you see at the top here. The good ones maybe look a little better even than they are. But in any case, there is a great deal of variation among conditions in different facilities. And that, in a way, from a research perspective, gives us a kind of natural laboratory for looking at the impact of various conditions. From an ethical perspective, I think we already know enough that we can anticipate that poor lighting really does have quite a lot of negative impacts, which I'll talk about in a moment. From an ethical perspective, it's really an imperative to not only to understand, to develop the research that we can show to our clients, and really to lobby for better conditions as architects in the facilities that we design. So lighting is a very high priority for research, for the development of standards, which we haven't talked about, but do affect quite a lot of correctional design, and also for action, for the actual designs. Let's see here. Okay. It's challenging to provide enough natural light in the correctional setting. Nobody's really mentioned it, but it's a contained environment. Security is important, and security-rated glazing is very expensive. So you tend to see, where you have windows, you tend to see rather small windows. Sometimes you see no windows at all. But it depends a lot. I mean, here's a picture of a cell that has quite a large window and appears to have pretty good natural light. There's a different approach, which I'll show you another picture later of this particular facility in San Mateo, California, where there is abundant lighting, and you'll see more of it in the shared activity area, the day room. The cells themselves are abundantly glazed in the front, and they don't have windows to the exterior generally. They borrow light from the day room. So there's kind of a question of how effective is this in providing light, and where are the inmates spending their time to be exposed to it? So one of the interesting things is that makes a natural laboratory of these jails and prisons is that the larger ones, and even the medium-sized ones, have housing units of similar design facing 360-degree orientations. So some of them that face north might never get sunlight, direct sunlight into the unit, whereas ones face south might get a great deal, and then the others might get an intermediate amount. So you have the opportunity in that case, as I'll talk a little later, to study conditions and their impacts in this kind of natural laboratory. Rich was talking about long exposure, but it's really only in low to medium security facilities that inmates actually get outdoors. And I think another part of my hypothesis is if inmates do get outdoors and are actually exposed to sunlight, it's probably going to mitigate the effects of what is happening with the lighting in their housing units. Then the other part, of course, is the artificial lighting, and I think I've already mentioned most of these things, but it's never really dark. It's a security situation where the operators of the facility believe they need to see people at all times and have enough lighting to be able to do that, and that means it's often too bright at night and probably interrupting sleep. Mentioned the narrow spectrum. They're often fluorescent lights. There's little or no variation in the lighting during the day if it's mostly artificial light, and again, no ability to control. And often, I wish I was looking through my slides to find a picture of this, because I know I've taken them in my career, but to find a picture of a cell where the inmates had actually been able to tape up paper over the light fixture in their cell so that they could sleep, sometimes not only during the day, but during the night, but also during the day. So, in a nutshell, the quality and level of lighting in correctional facilities affects the inmate's ability to sleep, of course, along with all the other things like interruptions and noise and people around them. And the results of poor sleep, many of the factors that Rich mentioned are also related to this, but in particularly Dr. Panda's talk, affecting the circadian rhythm and all the things that that does in the brain and to the health of the physical organism. How we measure these things, if you noticed in Rich's talk, it was all environmental psychology. It was not neuroscience. It was looking just at outcomes that could be measured without attaching a cap to the head of each inmate and having wires dangling from them and things that it's almost certain would not be allowed in a correctional setting. So all these effects of insomnia on mood and depression and tiredness and stress in general would mainly be looked at in the research setting by these outcomes that can be measured without really having to contact the individual directly or know who they are through an IRB. So it limits what we can do. We can see the next thing. Now, Rich mentioned that we also that staff are also there experiencing these things. They're staffed on a 24-hour basis, although there are generally fewer staff at night, but there are a substantial number of them. And we'd be very interested to look at their ability to adjust to odd sleeping hours, the impacts on health, productivity, job satisfaction, and turnover. So if poor lighting has the effects that we were talking about, the lack of sun, of natural exposure, of view, the poor artificial light. If poor lighting has all those deleterious effects, the question is, what about correctional facilities? And we do have some that are at least trying to provide good, if not excellent, natural light. Do we find better outcomes in those facilities? So, although it's a little more challenging to control the variables in the research, it would be very interesting to look at and compare the outcomes for similar kinds of inmates, similar lengths of exposure in some of the poor facilities and some of these that have or try to have excellent natural light. The question that occurs to me is, in these facilities that probably do have quite good natural light, is it good enough? What do we really want? What levels of lighting do we need, and are we achieving them? So briefly, I'd just like to put out a kind of agenda that we've been talking about amongst ourselves and looking for people to work with us, neuroscientists to work with us, and also for funding. And the agenda is, well, I guess this is the general part, but it's structured from the least difficult to do, things that don't require changes to the environment that you can do in what I call the natural laboratory and that don't require us to be engaging too much with the inmates directly. But the goal is to establish what the optimal daily pattern of light intensity and spectrum would be so that that can be built into standards and design practices. And we're also looking, I'll talk about that at the end, to encourage manufacturers to develop prototypes of programmable LED security lighting and then be able to install them in some units with before and after tests. Also, to change the lighting in the areas where staff principally work to more appropriate spectrums and light intensity levels to, okay, I have to really speed up. Okay, so I will speed up, I promise. I'll get through this really quick. So a couple of natural experiments, systems with large variations, wide variations, to look at the impact of them, to measure the actual lighting using maybe using that MyLux recorder or something like that to see how the pattern varies over the day. The second one would be to look at the impact of orientation, and then more minor interventions with no change to the building. I brought a prop here. If you hold the sleep mask, to issue sleep masks to inmates, probably not the standard one with the strings attached to it, but maybe something that adheres to the face. Measure the outcomes. A more minor intervention, again, would be to, within existing light fixtures, to replace the nightlight bulb to one of a more appropriate intensity and spectrum. And then finally, a more major intervention, which would be to replicate the study that was presented here at the last ANFA by Ellis Gonzalez and McEachran, where programmable LEDs were installed in a senior housing area and the impacts were measured. So we're going to go to our panel discussion now, and I'm hoping that that some of the challenges of how to measure impacts will be discussed. And then also I hope that we can talk about how architects use or misuse the data that we develop for them. No, thank you very much.
So I would first of all like to invite Huda to come up, and can we reconnect with Rich for the panel discussion? And while they do that, I'd like to invite maybe first Eve to give us any brief comments on what you've heard and some of your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Alison. And again, a pleasure to be here and to watch the development of ANFA into this real realm of interconnection between neuroscience and design. To that end, I'd actually like to ask how many of you are involved in justice architecture, be they courts, jails, prisons? Okay, this is perhaps 3 or 4 in the audience, and of course the panel here. So why does this matter to you? How many of you are involved in the design of places where you don't have complete control over your environment? Let me call them an office. Okay, and so what we've learned from the scientists and from the designers is highly relevant to all of us. And what it says is that we have to think about the timing and exposure and activity and metabolic status while we are in these places. And what's so clear in our industrialized societies, or let me now say lit societies, because there's programs all over the world that are bringing light and solar-powered light generators to countries where they have no opportunity to see at night. So in the outer reaches of poor communities where there's no electrical systems, they now have solar light, but we're not teaching them how to use this light and how to afford themselves sleep. They're using that light at night to continue working, to continue studying, to advance themselves. But they have to understand the negative impact also. It's an opportunity for us to jump into this right now and both give light and advise on a more appropriate use of light. So let me give you another example where we could make a big change. How many of you have stayed at a hotel during this conference? Okay. How many of you stay in a hotel where there is inadequate light in that hotel room? You walk in, you can't find the switch. The materials on the walls are dark, dull, and absorptive. Right. So as Sachin mentioned, our light during the day is also restricted. Our light at night, even if we close our curtains, is overdosed with our computer screens that happen to have a peak right in that blue range that stimulates melatonin. And so small, low-hanging fruit, the easy-to-do things is where we as designers today can have an impact, so long as we think about it and actually work together to change how we affect design. So although we don't know everything, there's an awful lot that we can do. And then let's add to it that there are tools out there that are more sophisticated than the tools developed in the 1950s that most people use to measure visible light. They actually measure circadian light stimuli. And we can begin to use those to understand how our materials are actually changing the exposure. There's another powerful force that we have available to us. The American Medical Association in 2012 came out with a policy statement that was a call for action to change our lighting, and a call for action to change night lighting in particular, because the recognition that there is inadequate darkness, and related it to the many medical conditions that we're talking about today. And hence this actually brings together everything that we've been talking about on this panel and with our keynote speakers, is we can see metabolic, genetic, and behavioral, as well as brain changes as a result of inappropriate lighting. And we have the power and the force of clinicians as well as research scientists to help us to make these small changes. We were talking about, you know, how do we bring our disciplines together? And Melissa was saying, we need to understand what you need to know. But since we speak different languages, use the same words to mean different things, then we can collaborate together to take your fascination, the phenomenology, the problems you encounter that your clients point to and your users point to translate them into hypotheses and controlled experiments that we can work together to effect.
Thank you. Would you like to take a couple of minutes and add your thoughts?
Yes, thank you.
And then we're going to open it up for discussion.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Now, what I want to give to you guys as things to think about is, it would be so helpful for us on the architecture side to hear the neuroscientists ask us, what do you want from us? What can we research for you? How can we take the problems that we've outlined and the many more that exist in corrections, and how can we operationalize that? How can we turn that into a study? How can we give you the information that will then become usable, a viable architecture solution, like the woman said earlier? What methodologies can we use? Because though most of us have dual backgrounds in psychology or neuroscience and architecture up on this panel and in this room, most architects do not. And so, as was mentioned, it can be very frustrating, I understand, for academics and researchers to do research that architects can use, and then we take it and apply it improperly, don't apply it at all, or move on because it doesn't adhere to some design vision. Now, for example, one thing that does come up in corrections, and in particular in jails, is in mental health research, or in jail best practices, we talk about programming. Let's get them in programs, mental health programming and job skills and this and that and the other thing. But what we found is that for psychologists have found, that's my background, is that very short duration of mental health intervention can actually do harm. But we haven't yet quite figured that out on the corrections side. And so we really need, as Eve had mentioned, to learn to speak, between architects and researchers so that we're communicating effectively how these solutions should be implemented so that we can then take it to the client. just a couple more things. One thing I also want to keep in mind is that the populations in correctional facilities are not baseline. The percentage of individuals who are arrested and detained for extended periods have developmental disabilities, a lifetime of poor nutrition, trauma and associated PTSD, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and then we put them in an oppressive environment and that gets exacerbated. Jails and prisons are also societies in and of themselves, and so it operates in a vacuum where whatever happens to you is already exacerbated, and then you're dealing with individuals who aren't even at zero. So we're dealing with an incredibly, incredibly vulnerable and sensitive population, and so this is why we keep coming back and saying, please, neuroscientists, help us. Please help us to find solutions, because we really want to do what we can on the design side to make people healthier. And then just one more comment. Cultural differences pertaining to justice. I was so grateful that Huda brought up the point that we in the meeting with the Scandinavian individuals, they talked about different perceptions of justice in Scandinavia versus maybe in the United States, and it's much more antagonistic here in the United States. And when I speak to people and I tell them that, I work in justice architecture, this is what I do, they immediately say, why don't you just build your facilities to look like Norway? Well, that'd be great. There are a lot of reasons we don't do that, but I think we can't just say that that's the ideal, because there are things that they do there that will not work here. And so those are the things that we need you guys to help us, to work with us, to research, so that we can make a justice system that works for our culture and makes our people healthy. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Looking forward to your comments.
So we are running behind schedule anyway, and we only have 5 minutes left for questions, and I'm sure there are a lot of them. So we're going to take as many as we can, but I know that the panel will be very happy to talk to you in the break as well. So do we have any questions? Yes, we have one right there. Can you get the microphone?
Very quick question on what your thoughts are on juvenile detention facilities, because several years back I was involved with an effort in Australia to completely rethink their juvenile detention facilities, and I found that they had flipped back and forth between the homey or versus the very hard prison type setting, And I'd like to know how your thoughts here, and whether juvenile detention facilities would be different than the sort of detention facilities we've been seeing for adults.
Should I take that?
Sure.
Well, hi Jim, I started my career working on a juvenile detention facility, and I've learned a great deal about them since. Obviously, there are developmental differences and brain development differences between youth and adults, and those need to be taken into account. Their impulse control is lower, and there are many other factors which I won't try to go into right now. But I think that while they're different, I think many of the issues that we're talking about also apply, because you've got involuntary incarceration. They certainly don't want to be there. You've got a lot of social dynamics that people have talked about that are going on. They're vulnerable, they need to be protected. Some of them are predators. So the variety of people is very wide. Our first project was a kind of, we didn't know anything. We had looked at the research, but there wasn't that much. But I was fortunate enough to be teamed with a talented, creative, thoughtful, and caring architect who was trying to imagine what the experience would be like for a juvenile coming into incarceration. And we together did as many things as we could to mitigate the stress and danger and fear and other deleterious effects on the kids. I'll give one example because we don't have much time, but we made the entrance transparent. Instead of just being a blank door where there's fear and no idea of what's on the other side, the youth was able to see where they were going, and their first transition, which was a sally port with 2 doors, was an open courtyard, open on the top, with a tree in it. So there was natural vegetation with all the benefits that might have, and a transparent wall on the interior part of it so that they could see where they were going. Just an example, but I think those kinds of issues apply to all levels of incarceration by age.
There's a question at the back here.
Hi. So as an aspiring architect, I've been encouraged by various organizations to take a political or ethical stance against unjust spaces by not designing prisons, or that we should not support such institutions. But how do you all feel we should react to this message and find ways to improve the place rather than to avoid it altogether?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. When you're sitting in control of the plan that you're drawing, you don't always have to disclose why that line that indicated a wall or a window or a place went in a certain location. So you can insert design based on evidence, research, these concepts if you're informed of them. And then when you have to defend those decisions, that's where you can bring forward, here's the evidence that suggests this design element will effect a greater change that will support you, the stakeholders, the client, and their users.
Can I
Thank you.
If I could just...
Yes, Huda, please.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment about strategy for a second, which is that, we talked about stress and depression and all of that, and we talked about light and circadian rhythms. And I like the focus on light because it's a very concrete thing that could be figured out in other places, like outside of prisons, like hospitals and offices and senior facilities, and then can be used with a lot of data to help inform how to do things in a very concrete way that's at the same time not that threatening to the way that where you put a lot of evidence without threatening the entire system and make headway. And it may be that it would be very hard to prove that lighting is transformative in the context of a prison when there is odors and noise and all of that, but you might be able to show it in an elderly facility or whatever, in high schools. And so I think strategy might be really important, and I'm bringing it up because it might also inform the decision making, that if you're an architect and you have a bunch of information like that that's well researched, that's not too aggressive, you can still be making a big difference.
I think we need to stop it there. I just want to say in closing that, I'll throw out another statistic. We spend about 3 times as much on an inmate as we do on a K-12 student. 2/3 of the inmates in our prisons have not completed high school. I think there's maybe an imbalance in that equation. And this is kind of looking forward to the panel this afternoon that's going to talk about, I think, K-12 or maybe beyond education. So we look forward to hearing that panel presentation as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much to the panel.